I don't know if I can do any better than that. Thank you, Amelia. It's funny. She says we might see Jesus when somebody gives us a closer parking spot at the store. Which I think, well, does that mean I can be Jesus when I give somebody a closer spot? I wouldn't know, because I never do. But I probably should. Thank you for that reminder. What a great topic to talk about, knowing Jesus. How can we know Jesus more? As Paul writes, I want to know Christ. I want to know Jesus. And more than I just want to know about Jesus. We talk about the things that Jesus said. We talk about the things that Jesus did. And we know a lot about Jesus, as if Jesus was somebody in history, a figure in history. But that's not what Paul's saying. Paul's saying, I know about Jesus, but I want to know Jesus. I want to truly know Jesus. And in the same verse, he says how he wants to know Jesus. By knowing the power of his resurrection. By knowing the power of his resurrection. The idea that Jesus wasn't raised from the dead. That Jesus is risen from the dead. Jesus was risen on Easter Sunday and continues to be risen. Meaning that Jesus is still risen today. That Jesus is with us, with you today. The risen Christ goes with us wherever we go. It's easy to forget that Jesus is with us. It's easy to forget that God is with us. And weeks like that, I've used this illustration before, but I just don't know a better one. Weeks like this, where it's rainy and cloudy all week. In Michigan, one November, it was cloudy 27 days out of the month. It's easy to forget that the sun exists when you don't see it for a few days. And it's not until you have that first day where there's not a cloud in the sky and the sun is shining that you walk outside and you feel the warmth of the sun on your face and you remember, yeah, that's why I live in Texas. That's what the sun feels like. I miss that feeling. So often, sin and busyness of life, the things we're so consumed with that aren't always totally sinful, just cloud out God. They cloud out Jesus to the point where we don't see Jesus in our daily walk in life. We forget that Jesus is with us when we're so focused on how our stocks are doing and how our sports teams are doing and how our job performance is going and sometimes even how our church is doing. We lose sight that God is with us. And sometimes we just have to peel all that stuff away and get down to Jesus. To know the power of his resurrection is to start over at the empty tomb. When we struggle to see where Jesus is in our life, we can always start over at the empty tomb and be reminded that the resurrected Jesus is risen and is with us. He says, to know the power of his resurrection and participation in his sufferings. To know Jesus is to participate in his sufferings. The easy thing here is to talk about Jesus' death on the cross, to talk about Jesus being nailed to a tree. But I'd have to believe that Jesus began suffering long before his death was on the horizon. I think that Jesus, at some point in his life, had hopes and dreams and desires and aspirations. Maybe he wanted to get married and have a family, and little Jesus is running around. Maybe he wanted to grow his carpentry business and have franchises and all these, and import and export. You'd have to think he was probably pretty good at being a carpenter, and he could just fix his mistakes with a wave of a hand. But he had to give all that up. He had to give up the things he wanted to do the things that God wanted him to do the things that he needed to do for you and I. And so, to participate in his sufferings, to know Jesus, we can give up some of the things that we hold on to, some of our desires. We can trade our selfishness for selflessness. To know Jesus, we can trade our anger for forgiveness. To know Jesus, we can trade our envy, our jealousy, our apathy for love. We can truly trade all the things that hold us back to become people that make a difference in our community. And it's not that we're going to suffer, but it's going to feel like suffering for a moment when we make the decision to give up the things that we love. But more than that, to know Jesus, to know the power of his resurrection, know he's with us, to participate in his sufferings, but it's also to share in his death, becoming like him in his death so that we can obtain the resurrection from the dead. My seminary professor, Dr. Mark Allen Powell, who you've heard me talk about before, who I just think the world of, wrote a book called Loving Jesus. He's written a number of books. And part of it, he writes about, and I shared this as a devotion with our council a couple months ago, about a woman who, when he was a pastor, he would visit, she was dying. And she asked what life was going to be like on the other side. What life in heaven was going to be like. Would she remember life in this world? And he thought about it for a moment, and he said, I've only been really sick once in my life. I mean, really, really sick. For about 24 hours. I was just so sick that I wanted to do anything I could to get better, even if it meant dying. Just, I wanted to stop feeling this way. I was so sick. And he said, that was years ago. Now, when I think back, I don't remember how miserable I was. I don't remember what it felt like to be that sick. I just remember being miserable. I remember being sick. Because when we get to heaven and look back on this life and all the pain and suffering that we experience, I don't think we're going to remember exactly how it felt. We're just going to remember that for a flicker in time, we went through some pretty difficult stuff. And that's the promise of the resurrection. Once we get to heaven, all the pain and sorrow and suffering of this life is going to be a flicker in time in our past, and we're not going to remember how deep it hurt, how painful it was at the time. We're just going to know that there were times where it hurt. So to be with him without distraction in heaven, without distraction of the pain and suffering of this life. It will be life at its fullest. It will be life at its best. And we will know Jesus in a way that we could only hope to in this life. And we will understand his love for us in such a way that it will make us wish that we searched for his love. Searched to know him in this life much earlier, much sooner, and much harder than we are now. Amen.